Hello everyone and welcome back to another Fate video. Normally, this would be considered a behind the servants. However, I want to touch on some more broad concepts that are introduced into Fate Grand Order. The concepts that I want to cover in this video are the Grand Servant system and the Beasts of Humanity. These are two fairly large concepts and are not explored very much in FGO. However, they play a huge role in the plot of the game. So, without further ado, let's get started. Naturally, this episode is going to be full of spoilers for the story of FGO, so if you're not caught up, or don't want yourself to be spoiled for it, come back to this video once you are. This has been your warning. The video will now begin in 3, 2, 1. Let us begin with explaining what a beast class enemy is. There are 14 beasts in totals. They come in two forms: those that have been oppressed and persecuted by humanity, and beings used to oppress and persecute by humanity. They exist as a natural byproduct of humanity and thus cannot be separated from us. They are fundamental to humanity, beings that exist because of human nature. So as long as humans are able to think, they shall have evil thoughts, and as such, we cannot directly rid ourselves of these beasts. But what or who take on the personifications of these concepts? Well, that's a difficult question. A beast candidate is not necessarily a beast in and of itself, but someone who holds the potential to become something more. Here's a tentative list of the beast candidates and actual beasts that we have encountered thus far. We have Goetia, Tiamat, Tamamovich, Sessio and Kiara, Ibuki Doji, the alien god / Olga, Kama, Cathpalug, and the beast 666, plus a couple of unnamed but referenced ones. Here is the sins that each of these candidates align with. Goetia is the sin of pity, Tiamat is the sin of regression, Kama is the sin of pleasure and depravity, Heaven's whole Kiara is the sin of pleasure and lust, Cathpalug is the sin of comparison, Tamamovich is the sin of treasuring. We don't know what the sin the beast 666 carries. We do know that one of the unknown beasts, however, is the sin of shame. To become a beast, one has to form a connection with humanity as well, even if that is an insane level of hatred. This is, for example, why Ashia Doman is unable to become a beast and instead enlists Ibuki to do it in his place. He feels nothing towards humanity and thus cannot become a beast himself. I neglected to add Angry Mango because he's listed as a beast candidate but does not achieve it. Tamamovich, who is also a candidate, still has more story to her that she may still well become a beast. The fact that in JP she is called Kolyanskaya of Light implies that there's going to be an even more evil side of her at some point. This one may become the full-fledged beast. The overall goal of the beast is to corrupt, distort, or destroy humanity. A good example of this is Kama. She held no love for humanity, but cared enough to want them to drown in their own pleasures, becoming worthless and corrupted. Each beast has an overpowered skill that goes along with their ascension to beasthood as well, known as a nega skill. Goetia's allowed him to not receive attacks from servants, Tiamat's was to create a bounded field that rejected the evolutionary course, Kama's was to cause corruption of any being that held desires, Kiara's was the ability to save only a world of her own, essentially making her immortal. Tamamo's is supposedly the ability to create any weapon that she desires, but this is speculation as she has yet to become a beast. In summary, the beasts are beings of sin with the overall goal of shaping humanity down a path of corruption or destruction, and they all have the means to do so. So, who could possibly defeat something that essentially cheats the system? Well, that is where the Grand Servants come in. Grand Servants are agents of the Counterforce, directly sent from the world to prevent the extinction of life or overall death of the planet. The natural course of action is that when one of the 14 beasts of humanity emerges, the 7 Grand Servants are summoned to dispose of it. Usually, when 7 servants are summoned, it means that a Holy Grail war is about to begin, and the servants, acting on the wills of their masters, will slaughter each other. This ritual is essentially the battery that charges the Holy Grail and allows for it to offer up a wish. Under normal circumstances, it is impossible to summon a Grand Servant to a Holy Grail war. It would be like killing a fly with a flamethrower. An exception to this occurs in Olympus, as the Godbreakers Alliance attempts to use a massive ritual summon to summon a Grand Servant. I tried to understand the explanation for this that I have on hand, but it's pretty complex. Something about using the natural ease of energy from Lost Belts and Singularities to generate enough mana to make the summoning possible. A Grand Servant is described by Hans Christian Andersen in-game as such. If servants are weapons meant to fight individuals, Grand Servants are weapons meant to fight the world. It's kind of wild to think about the concept of a being that is even on a higher plane of strength than a heroic spirit. We take for granted in FGO the use of noble phantasms, because a big part of the late game meta is figuring out how to fire them off as quickly and as often as we can. But a noble phantasm is something that can level cities or create cataclysms. Take Arjuna Alter's NP, which can be spammed out, is him destroying the entire world and then rebuilding it. Who better to fight a beast of humanity than him? Well, that's where heroism and notoriety come in. A Grand Servant is one of the 7 strongest of their era, the first 7 at the pinnacle of heroic spirits. To qualify, you must be, legitimately, the best there ever was in your class. Another thing to note is that a divine spirit or god cannot become a Grand Servant. If they have divinity, they must hold a connection to mankind. Every class has multiple candidates for who can become the next Grand Servant, with one exception. As time progresses, one may surpass another, or a prodigy may come about and claim the seat, in the event that something happens to the current sitting Grand. We see this as Solomon was the Grand Caster, but through his use of Ars Nova, he erased himself in order to save humanity. After this, Merlin would be appointed as the Grand Caster. This is a big point of contention though, as it was theorized for a while that Merlin was simply a candidate, but because he was at Chaldea he couldn't be a Grand Servant. A Grand Servant has to be willing to serve all of humanity. So to join Chaldea, they forfeit the right to their title as a Grand Servant, and then another will take their place. This relinquishing of the title does not dampen their power, however, and they are still able to use some of the authority granted from being a Grand. As for how Merlin still retains the title of Grand while being in Chaldea, well, that's because he's a cheater. The real Merlin is still in Avalon. The one that is in Chaldea is something like a very convincing hologram, but through this workaround, he technically does not forfeit his title of Grand. But who else amongst the heroic spirits could possibly be worthy of the title of Grand? We do have a small list currently, all of which have given up the title to assist Chaldea, save for Merlin. They are the Grand Archer Orion, renowned bowman of ancient Greece and on par with Heracles for his exploits, former Grand Caster Solomon, commander of the 72 demon gods and a dear friend to us all, current Grand Caster Merlin, Kingmaker Womanizer, Foe's Punching Bag, Grand Lancer Romulus Caernus, founder of Rome whose impact on humanity still resonates to this day. Though he is the son of a god, he chose to live as humans and thus maintained a connection to humanity, allowing him to become a Grand. Finally, Grand Assassin King Hassan, the leader of the Hassans and the reason why the word assassin even exists today. He is the one exception. There are no other assassins that have been as prolific as he has been, and thus the seat of Grand Assassin shall lay dormant. We know of one other Grand Servant, though we do not know their class or identity, as of the making of this video. All that we know is that their master is the cryptor David, who rules over the South American Lost Belt. This should imply that they are a South American warrior whose exploits earn them the right of being a Grand Servant. So for those of you who were thinking it was going to be like Super Kets, this is very unlikely as she is a divine spirit. That leaves us with 3 classes that have yet to reveal their Grand: Saber, Rider, and Berserker. Of course, they may pull the old switcheroo and introduce one of the Grands that took the place of one of the Chaldean Grands, but I do not think that this is likely yet. It will probably happen in the future. Let's have a little fun with this and play the speculation game. Feel free to let me know who you think will fill these roles. Let's start with speculating who David's servant will be. Also, I just want to get this out of the way. The reason why David is able to summon a Grand Servant is currently unknown, but he was described in Atlantis as, quote, a genius who could make the impossible possible, end quote. So that's a fairly ambiguous explanation that I'm sure will be explained eventually. If the current trend continues, then this will be a historical figure that appears in South American history. Here are my picks for David's potential Grand Servant. If it is a saber, I think it could be the Chilean hero Galavarino, who stood against the conquistadors. He was captured at one point and had both of his hands amputated, but still managed to fight by strapping knives to his wrists, managing a killing blow on a commander. Whether this makes him the pinnacle of all sabers, I don't think so, but it could be the impossible being made possible that David did would be something a candidate for Grand rather than the actual Grand Servant themselves. In reality, I just want him as a servant because the designs they could come up with for him would look amazing. As for riders, and this one may be controversial, but Hernando Cortez may apply for this position. As much of a bastard as he was, his impact on the whole of South and Central America can still be felt to this day. He is responsible for the destruction of the Aztec Empire and was hugely influential in the spread of the Spanish language in these parts of the world. His overall influence is larger than that of Columbus's, so it's possible for him to apply as a candidate. Or they could pull some nonsense and call it like the anti-Grand Servants and have it be made exclusively of anti-hero types, and that's where he comes in. For a South American Grand Berserker, I'll be honest with you, I do not know. However, I can imagine that they will likely try and pull something with the Nazca lines. For those who do not know, the Nazca lines are that series of animals that are made up of massive mounds of dirt around the 1st century, give or take. We do not know exactly how they were crafted or why, but I could see them pulling something cosmic with it, and personally, I'm here for it. But let's now look a bit more broadly. Let's start with the Grand Saber. Now, an obvious choice for this, and one I think we will see, is Miyamoto Musashi. I have unfortunately been spoiled for what happens to her during Lost Belt 5 already. However, I can see them doing a reveal of her being brought back. This theory may not hold any water, as we see the Grand Servant appear before she meets her end, so I'll throw out an additional one. Sun Tzu is a very likely candidate for Grand. His teachings in The Art of War are still studied closely to this day. Putting into print the blueprints of how to be a good general, and having that staying power last as long as it has, certainly makes him viable. Though it can be said that he would be better suited as a caster. I give him the saber status solely based on convenience, and less on it making the most sense, much in the same way that Caesar is a saber rather than a rider. Speaking of riders, Genghis Khan, leader of the Mongol hordes, is most certainly a grand candidate. The Golden Horde's consistent success and unwavering determination to conquer everyone that stood against them certainly shows in history. Given the nomadic nature of the Huns, this would likely make him a rider. Alright, so here's the thing. I am mostly positive that David managed to summon the Grand Berserker. My reasoning is from the little interaction that we've had with them. The Grand is concerned about the balance of life and death, and just seems to forget that they are in the Indian Lost Belt. This doesn't necessarily mean anything, and I'm absolutely reading into it too much, but this points to him being a little bit lost in the head, as Berserkers tend to be. The natural connection between life and death in the Fate series would be the Hassans, but they're all assassins. It can't be a divinity, so Herc also comes to mind. It's often brought up that if Herc was fully rational, he would be one of the strongest servants ever. But I don't really see them doing just a 5-star Herc unless it was the Archer Herc. So, who does that leave us with? Well, what about Hannibal, the Carthaginian general whose name is known throughout the world? I foresee him making an appearance in Fate at some point, but his prowess as a general are something to gawk at. As for why a Berserker over a Rider, I would chalk this up to his level of brutality and innovation in battle, though I concede that a Rider would be a better fit for him. But what do you think? Because that's it for me. That is the Beasts of Humanity and the Grand Servants in the books. This was a purely conceptual video, and I plan to make separate videos of these characters in the future, but for now, let's do the outro stuff. Like the video as it really does help out the channel, leave a comment about what you thought or who you would like to see next, subscribe to catch these as they go up, follow my Twitch for significantly less structured content, share if you are so inclined. Thank you all so much for the kind words I've been seeing recently about how I've been igniting a love of history in some of you. It really does spark joy in my heart. But for now, keep your chin up. Peace.